The Missouri rolled past Fort Union in slow, pewter-colored coils, carrying driftwood, silt, and the smells of faraway rain. Inside the tall palisade walls, men from half the world's frontiers moved among bales, hides, and barrels as if caught in the current of another kind of river, one made of trade and rumor. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer mingled with the guttural French of Métis freighters and the sing-song crow tongue of visiting hunters. Beaver pelts hung in fur-wrapped stacks, heavy with the musk of damp animal fat. Kegs of powder stood beside bolts of scarlet cloth, bars of lead, and small tins of vermilion paint that the tribes valued more than coin. Fort Union in those years was the hub of the upper Missouri, the warehouse and whispering post of an empire without borders. In the long house near the main gate, Charles Larpenteur, the fort's meticulous clerk, bent over his ledger, counting out plews, the beaver skins that were the coin of this wilderness. He barely looked up when the big door opened and Elias Hardesty stepped in, his buckskins bleached to the color of dry bone, his beard rimed with the fine dust of 1,000 miles of trail. "Back from the Yellowstone, are you?" Larpenteur asked, dipping his quill. Elias nodded, silent. His eyes were gray, the color of stormlight over sage, and they carried the uneasy stillness of a man who had spent too long among canyons and ghosts. He dropped a bundle of pelts on the counterlean take for a season's work. "Trapping's thinned," Larpenteur remarked. "Every fool that can set a steel trap thinks the mountains are paved with beaver. The trade's running leaner every year." Elias smiled faintly. "There's more than beaver in them hills." The clerk looked up. "You don't mean gold, do you?" "Silver," Elias said quietly. "Old silver." Larpenteur chuckled. "You've been listening to that crow medicine talk again." But Elias only unrolled a piece of stiff, yellowed vellum from inside his coat. The edges were curled, darkened as if by fire, and the ink had bled in strange brown rivulets. Across the surface ran thin contour lines, precise as the veins of a leaf, mountains, rivers, and a narrow pass marked with a crude cross and the faded words "Las Minas Perdidas." The clerk stared, frowning. "Spanish, looks like. But from where?" "That's the question." Rumor had already raced ahead of Elias downriver, that he had come back from the Powder River country with a fragment of a Spanish map, a piece of some lost chart carried north by trappers, or perhaps stolen from a priest's saddlebag a lifetime ago. Some said it came from Jedediah Smith's effects after his death in the Mojave. Others swore it was a forgery made by some drunken Mexican at Taos. Whatever the truth, it was enough to make the fort buzz like a hornet's nest. That evening, the big hall filled with pipe smoke and talk. Around the fire sat men whose names would one day anchor the ledgers of legend: William Sublette, hawk-nosed and neat as an officer; Lucien Fontenelle, half French, half Omaha, his eyes bright with speculation; and Larpenteur himself, who wrote everything down, even when he pretended not to. They talked of trade routes and rivers, of the latest news from Fort Pierre and Fort Mackenzie, and finally of the scrap of vellum Elias had laid on the table between them. Sublette squinted at it through the tobacco haze. "Could be a child's drawing for all we know. Spaniards never mapped this far north." "They did," Elias said, voice even. "Or at least one of them did." "You've heard of the old Coronado tales, silver, somewhere in the high mountains, dug by men who vanished before Lewis and Clark ever saw the prairie. This map marks one of their mines." Fontenelle laughed softly. "And next you'll tell me the Jesuits built a city of gold on the Tongue River." "Believe what you like," Elias said, "but I found this folded in an oilcloth packet under a slab of red stone place where no trapper ever camped. There were Spanish nails in the rock. Square-headed. Hand-forged." Sublette leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "And where was this?" "East side of the Bighorns, near a ridge shaped like a serpent." The others exchanged glances. Outside, the wind pressed against the palisade and made the logs creak like old masts at sea. Fontenelle poured a cup of watered whiskey and handed it to Elias. "Maps don't fill a belly. The fur trade does. If you want to die chasing ghosts, you'll find no partners here." Elias accepted the drink, nodded once, and rolled the vellum back into its oilskin. He could feel their laughter behind him as he left the hall. That night, the fort quieted under the black bowl of the prairie sky. The fires burned low, and the river whispered against its banks. From the bastion loft came the smell of tallow smoke and the rhythmic snoring of freighters sprawled on buffalo robes. Elias sat alone in the small room he rented, above the trade store, a space barely large enough for a cot, a table, and a lantern. On the table lay the map, unrolled once more, held flat with lead bars from the store below. He trimmed the lantern wick and bent close. The vellum surface shimmered like old parchment seen through water. Faint Spanish notations crawled across it. Sierra del Diablo, Paso de la Cruz, Rio Perdido. His finger traced the line that wound like a snake between two inked ridges, ending in the crude cross that marked the mines. "Devil's Ridge," he murmured. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the hollow clang of the flagpole halyard and the far-off howls of wolves across the prairie. Elias looked out the slit window toward the northwest, where the land rose dark against the stars. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the Bighorn Range, white with early snow, and perhaps, if the map spoke true, the bones of an empire that had once reached even here. He thought of Jedediah Smith's journal, which he carried like a prayer book. Smith had written of old trails paved in white stone leading into the sun. Many had called him mad too, yet he had opened more of the West than any man alive or dead. Elias dipped a quill into his own small bottle of ink and began copying the fading lines onto fresh paper, steady and deliberate. Each stroke felt like a vow. The trade outside Fort Union could have its whiskey and its plews. He wanted something older, something buried. At the door came a soft knock. It was Two Sleeps, a Crow Scout who traded occasionally at the post. The young man stepped inside without ceremony, his eyes catching the glint of the lantern on the map. "You look for Serpent Mountain," Two Sleeps said quietly. "Old place. Bad spirits live there. My father say Spaniard dig there once, long ago. Earth swallowed them." Elias met his gaze. "Then maybe it's time someone went and asked the earth what it's hiding." Two Sleeps said nothing more. He simply touched the beaded amulet at his chest, a sign for protection, and left. When the door closed, Elias stared again at the curling parchment, at the faint brown ridges and valleys drawn by some dead man's hand. The lamp flame trembled, throwing shadows that crawled like serpents across the wall. Outside, the Missouri murmured endlessly in the dark, as if whispering all the secrets men had lost and never learned again. And there, in the flickering light, Elias Hardesty traced the line once more, the Serpent Ridge, and whispered its name like a prayer. Devil's Ridge. The frost came early that year, hardening the riverbanks and whitening the cottonwoods before the geese had finished their long calls south. Elias Hardesty rode west with a small outfit, Jean Laframboise, a wiry Métis trapper who spoke more in grunts than in words. Jacob Wills, a lanky former clerk from Street Louis, soft-handed but eager for legend, and Two Sleeps, the Crow Scout whose silence weighed heavier than any rifle. Their pack mules moved single file along the valley floor, steam rising from their nostrils like offerings to the cold. They followed the Yellowstone River upstream, where the current glittered under thin ice and the air smelled of pine and ash. Every few miles they passed the ghost of an old trail, faint wheel ruts, or a broken cairn, the kind of marks that outlast men but not memory. To Elias, they were proof enough that others had come this way long before the fur trade, before Fort Union, before maps had borders. Somewhere among these ridges the Spanish had left their bones and their silver. Laframboise didn't see it that way. "Mon ami," he muttered one night over the fire, "every man that chases gold in these mountains ends the same lost or found by wolves come spring. Ask the ghosts of the Santa Fe road." Elias stirred the coals with a willow stick, and yet someone found enough to make the stories. The Métis spat into the fire. Stories weigh less than powder. Two Sleeps said nothing. He sat cross-legged, his face lit by the shifting glow. The Crow knew these lands better than any map. When Elias showed him the vellum days before, the young man had stared at the Serpent Ridge marked Sierra del Diablo and whispered an old name, the ridge that hunts men. It was a place his people avoided, where thunder struck without rain and the earth was said to breathe smoke. But he'd agreed to guide them anyway, saying, "Some paths choose the man." They made camp near a sandstone bluff carved with ancient petroglyph spirals, bison, and a single Christian cross chiseled into the stone's face. Jacob Wills found it first, calling the others over in excitement. "Spanish," he breathed, tracing the lines with a gloved finger. "No Indian cut like that. See the straight arms, the symmetry. It's proof, Elias. Proof your map's real." Elias felt a slow heat rise behind his ribs. He knelt beside the carving, the wind hissing through the dry grass around them. The cross was weathered but unmistakable. Laframboise frowned. "Could be made by any missionary from the south. There's Jesuits who wander this country too." "Not before 30 years ago," Elias said quietly. "This was here before any white preacher rode north of the Platte." They camped beneath the bluff, the fire casting red light on the ancient carvings. Elias opened his journal and copied the cross by lantern glow, noting its orientation facing west toward the mountains. "They went that way," he murmured. The vellum in his pack felt heavier than gold. The night dropped sharp and bitter. Coyotes yipped across the valley, answered by the far, deep bark of wolves. Wills couldn't sleep. He sat up and poked the embers. "You ever wonder if Smith was chasing the same thing?" he asked. "His last journey, the one that got him killed. Maybe he had a map like yours." Elias looked at him across the fading light. He did. Read his journals 1830, Mojave Route. He wrote of seeing stone pillars marked with crosses in the desert, of trails the Spaniards left when they searched for silver. I think he found their way north. Maybe as far as the Wind River country. Then why's he buried in sand and not silver? Wills asked. "Because some trails," Elias said, "don't end where you expect." By dawn, the bluff cast a long shadow across the frozen river. They broke camp, leaving only the faint imprint of their fire ring and the hoof tracks that would vanish by noon. As they moved west, Elias kept glancing toward the skyline, a long chain of peaks, dark under snow, the first teeth of the Bighorn Mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the truth that had burned men's hands for centuries. They crossed beaver ponds glazed with ice, climbed ridges, littered with elk sign, and forded streams where the water stung like knives. The country grew wilder, the sky larger, and each mile seemed to thin the world of men. Even Laframboise, who'd spent years in the Rockies, muttered prayers when they passed through canyons that swallowed sound. Once, at twilight, they found a half-buried musket with a silver trigger guard and Spanish work, its barrel rusted to lace. Elias cradled it in his hands like a relic. "Still think it's all stories?" he asked. Laframboise shrugged, but his eyes didn't meet Elias's. "A story with teeth, maybe." That night snow began to fall, slow, dry flakes that clung to their beards and froze in the mules' lashes. The fire hissed and died to embers. Two Sleep spoke softly in Crow, words that Elias didn't understand but felt in his bones. "What's he saying?" Wills asked. Laframboise translated under his breath. "He says the mountain is listening." Elias looked toward the west, where the white peaks loomed like ghosts waiting for judgment. The vellum map lay folded against his chest, warm from his body heat, as if it carried a pulse of its own. He thought of all who had come before Coronado's riders, the priests, Jedediah Smith, and wondered if they had felt the same pull, that thin, cold thread that led men into places no one else dared to name. By morning, the snow had covered their tracks, erasing every sign they had ever passed that way. The old trails were gone, but the ghost of them, the promise, the whisper lingered in the air like breath on frost. And so Elias Hardesty rode on, chasing a line on a burned piece of vellum, a line that led into the white silence of the Bighorns, where myth and map would soon become the same thing. The snow began as a whisper, a soft hiss against the spruce needles, and by nightfall it had swallowed the sky. The wind came next, fierce and unrelenting, like some vast beast exhaling across the ridges. Elias Hardesty's party climbed higher into the Bighorns, their mules half blind with frost, their breath freezing in mid-air. The world had become white and soundless except for the crunch of hooves and the rasp of their own lungs. For 3 days they pressed on, tracing the route drawn on the scorched vellum. The map's inked serpent ridge seemed to rise before them, now a jagged spine of rock winding north and west. Elias led, head bent, snow crusting his hat brim. Behind him rode Laframboise, muttering in French about madmen and fools. Two Sleeps moved silently, reading the wind like a tracker reads spoor. Wills, his face raw with cold, lagged and cursed, his optimism frozen away with the last of their whiskey. On the fourth morning, the world cracked open in light. The storm cleared without warning, revealing peaks sharp as broken glass and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. They stood at the edge of a canyon whose cliffs fell sheer to a ribbon of frozen water far below. Across the gorge, black rock thrust upward in a long curve that truly did resemble a serpent's back, each ridge a scale, each outcrop a fang. "Devil's Ridge," Elias whispered. "Just like the map." Two Sleeps touched the talisman at his neck. "Bad ground," he said. "Old fire under the snow." They descended by degrees, leading the mules in single file down switchbacks choked with ice. The canyon wind carried the smell of minerals, metallic, bitter, and in places the stone itself shimmered with a dull gray sheen. Elias knelt to scrape it with his knife. The blade came away dusted in silver flakes. Laframboise saw it too. "Looks like your ghost might bleed real," he said, forcing a laugh. But his eyes flicked warily at the sky, as if expecting it to collapse. They found a ledge at the base of the ridge, just wide enough for shelter. With axes and bare hands, Elias and Wills dragged downed pine trunks, notched them, and raised a cabin no higher than a man's shoulder. The walls leaned inward for strength, the roof low and packed with sod and bark, an idiot's cabin. Wills had called it when Elias first suggested the design. But by the second night, as the wind howled like cannon fire through the gorge, that idiot's cabin became their salvation. They burned green wood and buffalo chips, the smoke curling through a hole in the roof. The air inside grew thick, warm, almost sweet, compared to the shrieking cold outside. They thawed their boots over the fire and chewed strips of frozen pemmican until their jaws ached. "This winter," Laframboise said, "will be remembered, if we live to tell it." Elias nodded but said nothing. He was staring at the map again, laid open on his knee. The candle flame trembled over its surface. The serpent ridge he had traced now coiled beneath his fingers like something alive. "The mine's close," he murmured. "Maybe a mile from here, maybe less." Wills laughed bitterly. "We're half dead, and you're still dreaming of silver. You'll find nothing but rock." Elias's eyes flicked up, calm but hard. "Rock, maybe, but the Spaniards left more than footprints. We've seen the signs, the cross, the musket, the oar. The Spaniards died here too," Wills said. "Maybe that's the only thing they left." Two Sleeps listened from the corner, his face unreadable. "The mountain tests all men," he said softly. "Some it lets pass, some it keeps." Outside, the wind shifted again, a deep moaning note that rose and fell like a living thing. The storm returned in the night, piling drifts against the cabin until it seemed the whole mountain pressed upon their roof. For days they were buried in white silence. The food dwindled. The mules froze where they stood, eyes glassy as marbles. Time itself lost meaning. The days became a single gray twilight, broken only by hunger and the sound of breathing. On the seventh morning, Wills could take no more. He burst from the cabin into the snow glare, shouting that he'd rather die walking than rot in a hole. Elias tried to stop him, but the man's shape vanished into the white before another word could be said. They found him 2 days later, a mile downslope, frozen stiff beside the half-dug pit where he'd thought he'd seen ore glittering through the ice. His hand still clutched a rock that might have been silver or only fool's quartz. Laframboise and Two Sleeps buried him in the snow, marking the spot with crossed sticks. The mountains swallowed the sound of their prayers. That night the wind dropped. A strange calm settled over the canyon. Through the smoke hole, Elias saw the stars burning close and cold. He felt the map's weight inside his coat heavier now, as though it knew it was the last witness. He wondered if the ridge itself was alive, if the earth beneath them remembered the Spaniards who had cut into its flanks centuries before. He fed the fire, then leaned his back against the log wall. The cabin creaked like a ship in ice. His eyelids drooped, and for a moment he thought he heard distant voices, the clink of hammers on stone, the faint ringing of metal deep underground. Perhaps memory, perhaps the mountain's breath. In the morning the wind would rise again, and the snow would fall for 40 days, sealing them from the world. But that night, wrapped in the smoke and the glow of his idiot's cabin, Elias Hardesty felt something stir in his chest that was not fear or madness, but certainty. The ridge was real, the map was true, and somewhere beneath the frozen earth the devil's silver still slept. When the thaw came, it came with violence. Snow melt roared down from the high saddles, carving black channels through the drifts. The little cabin that had kept Elias Hardesty and his 2 surviving companions alive all winter shuddered under the runoff. The roof leaked in a dozen places, and the air stank of wet hides and smoke. But the world outside was reborn, green shoots piercing the snowbanks, the river breaking its frozen skin, and the call of geese echoing through the valley like news from another life. Elias stepped into the sunlight, weak-kneed but alive. The mountains glistened, washed clean. 2 Sleeps stood on a rise above the camp, scanning the west where the Serpent Ridge coiled its black spine into the distance. The crow's braids were stiff with frost, his eyes narrowed against the glare. "The storm has gone," he said. "Now the mountain will speak." Laframboise, gaunt and hollow-eyed, laughed without humor. "Let it speak quick, then. I've near forgot what silver looks like." He still walked with a limp from frostbite, and half his beard was white with scarring. But the promise of what might lie under that ridge rekindled something fierce in him: greed, hope, madness. Elias couldn't tell which. They spent 3 days climbing higher, following a dry creek bed, strewn with pale stones that glinted faintly even under cloud. The air grew thinner, pine gave way to bare rock. At the crest of a narrow saddle, the ground leveled into a bowl-shaped canyon half-choked with debris. There, set against the cliffside, they found it a wall of hand-laid stones blackened by centuries of weather, and beside it the rusted frame of what had once been a furnace. The mouth gaped like a broken jaw. Scattered around were shards of crucibles, bits of slag, and an iron bar fused to the rock by old fire. 2 Sleeps crouched beside the ruins and touched one of the stones. "Men made this," he murmured, "long before my grandfather's time." Laframboise let out a sharp bark of laughter. "By God, Elias, you were right." He pried loose a fragment of ore from the rubble and struck it with his hatchet. It split with a silver glimmer beneath. His eyes went wide. "Look there, pure vein." Elias knelt beside him, brushing away the dust. The vein ran deep, into the cliff face, a gray metallic ribbon embedded in the granite. A shiver went through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "The lost mine," he whispered. "Las minas perdidas." They worked feverishly, chipping samples, digging out what they could with pick and knife. As they dug, they uncovered more evidence: a rusted shovel with a Spanish mark, a rosary half fused into a lump of ore, and the outline of a collapsed tunnel leading into the mountain. Inside, the air was cool and still, and the faint smell of ash lingered, a grave of forgotten men. Laframboise's excitement turned feverish. "We'll load the mules, take what we can, and head south to Santa Fe," he said, eyes glittering. "We'll be rich before next snow." Elias didn't answer. He ran his fingers over the crucifix, its surface worn smooth by hands long gone. "We should mark the place, not rob it blind. The earth doesn't give freely, it remembers." The Métis sneered. "You sound like your crow friend. Since when did you turn priest?" 2 Sleeps stood apart, watching the clouds crawl over the peaks. "The mountain will not let you take its heart," he said. "It buried these men once. It will bury again." That night they camped near the ruins, firelight flickering on the old furnace stones. The air hummed with meltwater running under the ground. Elias couldn't sleep. He sat outside the circle of light, the vellum map spread across his knees, comparing its faded lines to the canyon around him. Everything matched the Serpent Ridge, the cross, the pass. Yet he felt no triumph, only a deep unease, as if he had trespassed into another man's dream. Near midnight he heard voices low, urgent. He turned. Laframboise and Wills's old rifle lay missing from its usual place. 2 Sleeps slept with one arm over his chest, unaware. Then a shadow moved near the furnace mouth, and steel flashed in the dark. Elias lunged just as the hatchet swung. The 2 men crashed into the dirt, the fire scattering embers. Laframboise's face twisted with greed and rage. "You'll not cheat me of this," he spat. "It's mine, all of it." Elias struck him across the jaw. The man fell back, bleeding, wild-eyed. The fight tumbled them against the furnace wall. A sharp crack echoed the sound of stone giving way. The ground trembled, the slope above them shifting. 2 sleeps shouted a warning as the ledge collapsed in a thunder of rock and dust. The furnace mouth caved, swallowing Laframboise and half their tools in an avalanche of scree. When the dust cleared, the mine entrance was gone, sealed forever by the mountain's own hand. Elias stared at the ruin, chest heaving. 2 sleeps laid a hand on his shoulder. "The mountain has chosen," he said. They buried what little remained of Laframboise by the creek, stacking stones over the mound. Elias placed the silver crucifix atop it. "Better this," he murmured, "than dying, for something you can't carry." He rolled the vellum map tight, sealed it in a small keg of pitch, and buried it deep beneath the roots of a pine. "Let it rest," he said, "until someone wiser comes." For 2 days they lingered in silence, the wind sighing through the pines. Then they turned east toward the plains, leaving behind the ridge that gleamed faintly even under cloud, the serpent's back, glistening with silver dust. When they reached the valley, Elias looked once more at the mountains, receding into haze. He felt no triumph, only a strange peace, as if the land itself had spoken its last word. The lost mines were real, but their promise was a curse too heavy for men to bear. 2 sleeps said it best, softly, as they rode into the thawing wilderness. "Now the ghosts can sleep again." The plains below the bighorns were green that summer, rolling in waves of grass that shimmered like water under the sun. Elias Hardesty and 2 sleeps came down from the high, a country like men returning from the dead. Their clothes hung in tatters, their rifles rusted from thaw and rain, their faces burned to leather. But they were alive, and that alone felt like fortune enough. For 2 weeks they followed the Yellowstone east, keeping to the tree lines and old game trails. The land smelled of sage and dust, of rebirth after ruin. Elias felt the mountain silence still clinging to him, the weight of buried silver, of ghosts that had chosen to stay hidden. At night he dreamed of the serpent ridge crumbling into white light, of the map sealed forever in its pine grave. He would wake before dawn, listening to the wind and wondering if he'd been spared or cursed. They found the crow by accident, or perhaps, as 2 sleeps said, by fate. One evening, as they skirted a willow break along the river, arrows hissed from the shadows and thudded into the dirt before their horses. The sound was like bees tearing the air. Elias raised his hands, calling out in the man. Few crow words he knew. 2 sleeps stepped forward, speaking quickly, his tone even. Shapes emerged from the brush, men with faces streaked in black and red, their bows drawn but eyes curious. One of them wore an otter fur band around his head, and on his chest hung a necklace of silver discs that caught the dying light. After a long silence, the leader lowered his bow. "You walk with one of our people," he said, nodding toward 2 sleeps. "You will come." They were led to a large encampment near a bend in the river, where hides stretched between poles like sails and smoke rose in thin blue lines. Women tanned robes and dried berries. Children ran with sticks and laughed. The crow greeted 2 sleeps with quiet nods. But the sight of Elias, gaunt, foreign, with gray eyes and the smell of gunpowder still on him, drew wary stares. Yet no one raised a weapon. The chief, a broad-shouldered man named Arapouche, known among whites as Sore Belly, received them with a dignity that needed no words. 2 sleeps spoke long into the night, telling of the storm and the death of Laframboise, of the mountain that swallowed men whole. Arapouche listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on the fire. When the story ended, he rose, stepped close to Elias, and said in careful English, "You have seen the mountain that kills. My father saw it once. He said the earth there breathes. It does not want men." Elias bowed his head. "Then I will not trouble it again." The chief studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good. Then you will stay among us until the spirit of that place leaves you." And so he did. The crow gave them a small lodge near the edge of camp. Elias mended traps and sharpened knives to repay their kindness. He learned their words for river, fire, sky. The rhythm of their life was unlike any he had known, built not on conquest or trade, but on balance. In the mornings he helped gather wood. In the evenings he listened to stories told by the elders, of the trickster Old Man Coyote, of mountains that spoke, of strangers with shining faces who once came north to dig holes in the earth and were buried by thunder. Each tale felt like an echo of the Spanish miner's fate. As weeks passed, his strength returned, but his old hunger, the fever that had driven him to chase the lost mines, did not. Instead, he found a strange calm in the crow's way of seeing the world. Two Sleep seemed content too, laughing more easily now. Once, while fishing along the river, Elias asked him if he ever thought of returning to the ridge. Two Sleeps shook his head. Why go back to a place that remembers death? The mountain is full now. It sleeps. We should not wake it. Elias watched the sunlight ripple on the water. Then maybe that's all a man needs to let things sleep. When the trading season came, a few white trappers visited the Crow camp, bringing powder, beads, and tobacco. Among them was a young Frenchman from Fort Union who recognized Elias. He stared as if seeing a ghost. "By thunder, they said you froze last winter," he said. "Larpenteur himself wrote you off his ledger. What happened to your Spanish map?" Elias smiled faintly. "Buried it." "Buried it? That was your fortune." "Maybe," Elias said. "But some fortunes are better left underground." The Frenchman laughed, thinking it a joke, and rode off toward the river with his pack train. Elias watched him go, feeling no envy, no regret. He had crossed a line most men never saw a boundary between wanting and knowing, and he had no wish to return. When the leaves turned yellow that fall, Arapusha's people prepared to move south for wintering grounds. Elias joined them, riding with Two Sleeps through the wind that carried the smell of drying grass and the first snow. One evening, as they looked back toward the mountains, the peaks glowed red in the sunset. Two Sleeps said, "That is the mountain's blood. It bleeds every year when the snow leaves. It remembers." Elias nodded. "Then let it remember. We've done enough forgetting." He carried nothing from the ridge but memory, the image of silver in the stone, the crucifix glinting in firelight, and the echo of the mountain's breath. The vellum was gone, the legend sealed. Yet in some quiet way, the truth remained alive, not in maps or treasure, but in the endurance of those who had seen it and walked away. By the time the Crow camp disappeared into the southern plains, the man who had once chased a myth through the bighorns was gone too. What remained was something leaner, steadier, a man who finally understood what the mountains had been trying to teach all along, that not every discovery is meant to be claimed, and not every map is meant to be followed. The Missouri shimmered again in the autumn light, just as it had when Elias Hardesty first rode out with his map and his half-believed legend. Now he came back older, leaner, carrying no silver but a handful of Crow trade goods and a crucifix dulled by weather. His buckskins were patched with otter hide, his rifle wrapped in rawhide for lack of oil, and in his eyes burned a quiet that made the fort men fall silent when he passed. Fort Union hadn't changed much. The same high walls, the same creaking gates, the same smell of hides and smoke and whiskey. Inside, the noise of the fur trade rolled on Métis freighters, shouting in French patois, Sioux bringing robes by the pony load, and white traders weighing plews with the same cold precision as ever. But to Elias, it felt smaller now, as if the whole fort were shrinking inside the vastness of what he had seen. Charles Larpenteur met him in the trade room, ledger in hand. He blinked twice, uncertain. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "I marked you as dead 2 winters back." "Near enough," Elias said, smiling faintly. He laid the crucifix on the counter. Thought this might prove otherwise. Larpenteur picked it up, turning it in his fingers. "Spanish by the look. You find your mines?" Elias shook his head. "Found what was left of them. Not what I went for." The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Then what did you bring home, Hardesty?" Elias looked past him to the open door where sunlight slanted through the dust. "A story," he said simply. "And a way to build a cabin that keeps a man alive when the world decides he shouldn't be." That winter at Fort Union was remembered for its cruelty. The ice came early, sealing the river before the last keelboats could leave. Snow drifted higher than the palisade. Men died of fever and hunger. The ones who lived crowded into log shelters that smoked and leaked, cursing the cold. Elias built his differently low-roofed, earth-chinked, its door facing east away from the prevailing wind. The others laughed at first, calling it Hardesty's Hole, a fool's den fit for a badger. But when the mercury froze and the whiskey turned solid in the kegs, his cabin stayed warm enough for breath to rise in thin mist instead of ice. By January, half the fort's men were copying his design. Larpenteur recorded it in his journal that spring, noting, "A certain Elias Hardesty has shown that wisdom lies not in comfort, but in endurance. His idiot's cabin, as the men first called it, has kept them from freezing outright." Elias never corrected the record. Let them keep their jokes. The mountain had taught him that mockery was the tax every truth must pay before men believed it. He spent the thaw trading crow robes for powder and seed corn. He worked with the blacksmith, repairing traps and shoeing mules. When the river finally broke, he helped mend the dock pilings, his hands as steady as any craftsman's. But at night, when the fort quieted and the river whispered beyond the walls, he would take out the small journal he kept weathered, stitched in deerskin, and write by tallow light, not about silver or mines, but about storms, hunger, and the strange peace of surviving them. Sometimes the others pressed him for the full tale. Sublette came north that summer and cornered him at the mess table. "So it's true then," Sublette said, chewing his pipe stem. "You found something out there, old workings, Spanish marks." Elias nodded. "And bones. Then why didn't you bring proof? Men would stake half the territory to find what you saw." Elias looked at him levelly. "Because what's buried out there belongs to the mountain. We only borrow what the land forgets to keep." Sublette grunted, unsatisfied. "You sound like one of them Indians now." "Maybe they had it right before we did," Elias said. He left the table to the sound of laughter, but the kind without teeth. Late that fall, when the cottonwoods turned gold along the river, Elias took a ride out past the bluffs, where the prairie opened wide. He sat his horse and watched the sun sink behind the far ridges. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the serpent spine, the devil's ridge, and the ghost of the map sealed under pine and snow. He imagined the crucifix still resting atop La Framboise's cairn, gleaming faintly when the lightning came. 2 sleeps had gone back to his people, carrying stories of a white man who listened more than he spoke. Elias never saw him again, though sometimes he thought he heard his voice in the wind's long whistle across the grass. He turned his horse toward the fort as the first stars rose. Behind him the land darkened into shadow, vast, unknowable, unchanged. Ahead, Fort Union's lanterns flickered like candles in a church too small for its god. By the time he reached the gate, the men were already talking of new expeditions west to the Wind River, south toward Santa Fe, chasing gold, pelts, and glory. They asked if he'd join them. He smiled, shook his head, and said, "I've already been far enough to know where the road ends." That winter, when the blizzards returned, every cabin in the fort was built after Hardesty's pattern. The men who had once mocked him now called it the Hardesty Shelter. They never knew how much of that design came from watching wind-carved drifts around a cabin under Devil's Ridge, or from listening to a crow scout say, "The mountain keeps what it loves." Elias Hardesty never left the upper Missouri again. Some said he died there in '39, others that he rode south to join the Crow for good. But long after his name faded from ledgers, his cabin remained copied in forts from the Yellowstone to the Platte, standing against the wind with the quiet defiance of the man who built it. And when trappers huddled inside on nights when the storm howled like judgment, they sometimes spoke of the fool who outlasted the mountains, the man whose idiot's cabin had outwitted the cold. The young surveyor's name was Henry Lathrop, a man of 26, with a sunburned face and spectacles smudged from dust. He had come west with the United States Geological Corps, tracing the great rivers and cataloging the seams of rock that would one day fuel the nation's engines. In the spring of 1872, his team camped along a pine slope above the Grable River. They were mapping coal beds when a pick struck something hollow beneath a fallen tree, a keg, tar-sealed and black with age. Lathrop pried it open with his field knife. Inside lay a roll of stiff vellum, yellowed like old bone. When he unwrapped it, the ink lines shimmered faintly, the symbols clear, though the edges had burned. Across the top, in a spidery Spanish hand, he read, "Las Minas Perdidas." Below, the mountain contours matched perfectly with the bighorn country spread before him. A ridge shaped like a serpent curved across the page, ending in a cross. His companions thought it a curiosity, a relic of conquistador fancy. But Lathrop, trained in the new precision of triangulation, recognized that the map's scaling was uncanny accurate to the mile. He compared it to their instruments and found every river and saddle aligned with his own charts. Whoever had drawn it had known this land before the Corps, before Fremont, before even Lewis and Clark had dreamed of it. That night, as the campfire snapped and the wind sang through the pine needles, Lathrop turned the map in his hands and wondered whose bones had guarded it. The keg had been buried deep, the lid sealed with pine pitch preserved like a secret intended for another century. Across the bottom margin, faint and almost erased, he made out an English name written later, in a rougher hand, E. Hardesty, 1834. He mentioned it the next morning to the senior geologist, an older man from Street Lewis named Captain Reynolds. The captain squinted at the inscription. "Hardesty," he said slowly. "There was a trapper by that name on the upper Missouri once. Died before the railroads came. Some say he had a Spanish map that led nowhere." "Then this must be it," Lathrop said. Reynolds smiled thinly. "Then perhaps it led exactly where it was meant to the ground." They carried the vellum back to camp and at the end of the season to Street Lewis. From there it passed into the keeping of the Smithsonian Institution, labeled Spanish Indian Composite Map, Northern Territories circa 1600s recovered, 1,872. In the archives, no one noticed the faint second signature. But Lathrop kept a copy, tracing it carefully by lantern light before he shipped the original east. On his duplicate, he wrote in the margin, "Recovered near Devil's Ridge, Bighorn Range." That winter he returned to Washington to present his findings. The scholars were polite but skeptical. A Spanish map of Wyoming was absurd. They said no expedition had come this far north in the colonial period. The vellum, they insisted, must have been the work of some imaginative trapper mixing, frontier rumor with wishful cartography. Lathrop, though, could not shake the feeling that the map's lines were more than fancy. He had seen too many accidental truths emerge from old myths to dismiss this one outright. He spent his evenings combing the ledgers of the American Fur Company, looking for Hardesty's name. It appeared only twice. Once in a Fort Union inventory from 1832, Elias Hardesty, trapper, returned from Yellowstone with 24 plews, one Spanish relic, and again 4 years later. Appended in Larpenteur's spidery hand, Hardesty's shelter model adopted for winter quarters. Man departed the country, no further record. In those two brief entries, Lathrop pieced together a life. A man who had gone into the mountains chasing a myth, returned with wisdom instead, and vanished. The crucifix, the cabin, the buried keg, all the remnants of a story that history had forgotten, but the land had not. That summer, driven by curiosity, he rode back to the Bighorns alone. The ridge was easy to find, its spine still coiled black and shining under the sun. At its base, amid the rubble and the wildflowers, he found a line of stacked stones half buried in moss, a cairn. On top lay a fragment of metal weathered nearly smooth. When he lifted it, he saw it was silver, marked faintly with a cross. He set it back gently and stood there for a long time. The wind moved through the grass, whispering over the stones as though the mountain itself were breathing. In that sound he thought he heard the echo of an older age of axes striking rock, of a man building a cabin against a storm, of a voice murmuring, "Let it rest." Lathrop didn't dig. He didn't measure or claim. Instead, he unrolled his copy of the vellum, laid it on a flat stone, and made a final notation at the bottom. The mines are real, but so was the man who chose to leave them lost. He folded it, sealed it in his field book, and rode east at sundown. Behind him, the ridge darkened, its curves glowing faintly under the last light. Years later, when railroads cut through the Yellowstone and telegraph wires sang across the plains, the engineers still built their winter stations after a pattern first recorded at Fort Union low-roofed, earth-chinked, strong against the wind. No one remembered the trapper who'd designed it. But every time the snow closed in and the walls held firm, the men who lived there unknowingly honored the same quiet wisdom that had once kept Elias Hardesty alive beneath Devil's Ridge. And somewhere under pine and shale, the sealed Kegs twin, the memory of silver, of hunger, of endurance slept still, untouched by map or myth, waiting for another century to find it and wonder again.